in this third part of this lecture video, we will basically discuss the problems with this kind of conceptualization of environmental movements by Ramchandra Guha, Madhav Gadgil and Joan Martinez Alier. So, the mainstream perspective of Indian environmental movement perceive them as reflections of disenchantment with the state led development paradigm. As I just mentioned that these environmental movements point out towards an alternate development paradigm. They find problems with the existing development practice because this development practice results in unequal distribution of resources and unequal distribution of benefits. And therefore, the mobilizations or environmental mobilizations by this kind of literature were viewed as actions by the marginalized poor, actions by the local people to protect environmental means of livelihood and sustenance. So, therefore, the popular conceptualization or the mainstream conceptualization of Indian environmental movement has been that these are localized struggles in defense of livelihood. These are localized struggles in defense of the local space, local resources, which bear an anti-developmental or conservative attitude. So, therefore, Indian environmental movements are often described as development conflicts. These are essentially ecological conflicts, development conflicts which arise out of a capitalist model of development. So therefore, when we see Indian environmental movements like the case of Narmada Bachao Andolan, like the case of Chipko, like the case of Chilika Bachao Andolan. So, these kind of environmental struggles where we find that essentially there is a development program, there is a development project which results in environmental degradation as well as loss of livelihood, and therefore, we find people on the street. Therefore, we find popular mobilization protesting these kind of development which results in environmental degradation and loss of livelihood. However, this way of conceptualizing Indian environmental movements as localized struggles, as local conflicts in defense of land, in defense of livelihood and in defense of local control over natural resources has certain problems. These are problematic because of certain emerging trends in Indian environmental movements, that the new kind of movements that is coming out, the new kind of environmental activism that is coming out in India, they are not essentially localized struggles in defense of land, livelihood, and there are larger issues in these environmental movements. So, let us understand that what are the major problems of this kind of conceptualization which we gain from writings, from literary works from Ramchandra Guha, Madhav Gadgil and Joan Martinez Alier. This way of explaining Indian environmental movements as localized struggles in defense of livelihood fail to highlight the global local nexus, the global local connections in Indian environmental movements. As I just mentioned in my previous module, that environmental movements may be best understood as networks which bridge the gap between the local conflicts and the global concerns. However, when we perceive these conflicts as local struggles, when we perceive these conflicts as struggles by the affected people, by the affected local people, we fail to realize the larger picture. We fail to understand the larger picture that these movements are not essentially localized struggles, they are also connected with the global issues, they are also connected with the global players or the global networks. So, therefore, this conceptualization of Ramchandra Guha and Joan Martinez Alier fail to explain how local struggles get connected with global actions or global ideologies and vice versa. So, therefore, they perceive them as small scale localized struggles in defense of land, livelihood and resources, whereas these struggles essentially pass on a global message and they connect with actors, they connect with environmental organizations, environmental movement organizations working at the non-local level, and in that sense they no longer remain as localized struggles. They may begin at a particular locality, like I mentioned in the last class, there is a physicality, locality which is important to begin an environmental movement, but once they begin, they do not limit themselves to that locality. But Ramchandra Guha's framework of understanding environmental movements as localized struggles in defense of livelihood failed to understand these local global linkages in environmental movements. Secondly, the overemphasis on affected people, poor citizens, local citizens, that underscores the relevance of other groups, other intellectuals or other social movement organizations who have nothing to do with local, but who also participate in these environmental movements. So, essentially when we say that these are movements by affected people, by the local citizens, then we are undermining the great role, the crucial role played by the scientific community, played by the intellectuals, played by the environmental movement organizations who have nothing to do with locality. They don't stay at the place where there is environmental degradation has happened. They are not directly affected by environmental degradation. Their livelihood is not at stake. Perhaps their livelihood doesn't directly depend upon nature, but still they are there in these mobilizations. And not only they are there physically, they have played crucial role. How do we understand this phenomenon? How do we understand this reality? When we say that these are movements, these are mobilizations by the affected people, by the local citizens, we undermine, we underscore the crucial role played by non-local organizations, non-local environmental movement organizations, non-local entities. They may be intellectuals, they may be activists, they may be scholars, they may be lawyers, they may come from different range of activities, they may come from different range of occupations, but what is common to them is their shared concern for nature. They may not be directly affected by natural by degradation of nature, their livelihood may not be at stake, but still they are there in the movement physically and also playing the leadership role. So therefore, it will be wrong to perceive, it will be too minimalistic to say that these are localized struggles involving the affected people. I mean, even if you take the case of Narmada, it is not that only those who are affected, they were there in the movement. It is true that the mass participation comes from the affected people, but when we see the leadership structure in Narmada movement, when we see the leadership structure in any environmental movement, we find that it is the intellectuals, it is the social workers, it is the activists, it is the scientists, the lawyers. They have played great role, they have played crucial role in this mobilization. So therefore, perhaps it will be too minimalistic to say that these are localized struggles in defense of land and livelihood, and where we find where there is a overemphasis on affected poor, local citizens and local people. Essentially, what I am arguing, they are not so local. They are not so local because the mobilization may begin with the local, but it gets connected with the non-local, it gets connected with the global. So in that sense, what is to be highlighted, as I mentioned in the previous module, is the networking between the local and the global, the connection between the local and the global, not perceive them as localized struggles involving the affected people. The third problem with conceptualizations of Ramchandra Guha and Joan Matthieu earlier is that the Indian environmental movement's claim of searching for an alternative, searching for an alternate paradigm to development, searching for an alternate way to practice development is too generalistic, because when we see any social movement, perhaps finding an alternate way, finding an alternate social structure, finding an alternate way of life is common to all social movements. So in that sense, social movements essentially demand something which is different from the status quo. Social movements essentially reject to negotiate with the status quo, and it demand for an alternate ways, alternate means of life, livelihood and social structure. So in that sense, it is not that Indian environmental movements only talk about alternatives. In fact, any social movement talks about alternatives. The fourth important problems with Ramchandra Guha's framework is the anti-science characterization of these movements, because essentially these movements highlight problems with modern science, highlight problems with modern technology, because it considers modern technology as problematic. It is the modern science, modern technology which has resulted in environmental degradation, and therefore there is a loss of livelihood, and therefore people are against it. So essentially the enemy becomes the capitalist state, the enemy becomes the modernization, the enemy becomes science and technology. But essentially, as we discussed in the previous class, as Manuel Castells argues, contemporary environmental movements are becoming more and more science based movements, because scientists, scientific knowledge, popular science plays an important role in explaining the risk to the people, in explaining the consequences of certain activities to the people. So therefore, these environmental movements depend to a greater extent on science and scientific knowledge, and that is something which is missing in Ramchandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil's conceptualization of environmental movement. If you take the contemporary environmental movements, like for example, we may refer to the anti-nuclear movements, we may refer to the anti-mining movements. It is the scientists who play a great role in explaining the negative consequences of these kind of activities, these kind of development processes. So, as I told that it is a conflict of science against the science. So, science definitely plays an important role. While one scientific technology creates problem, another scientific knowledge tries to popularize, tries to explain the negative consequences to the people. But conceptualization of Indian environmental movements as anti-science, as anti-modern, as anti-globalization movements perhaps results in undermining the role played by scientific community, the role played by scientific knowledge. As I told that these contemporary environmental movements are more and more science-based movements, and science essentially plays a great role at least in explaining people the risk, and then only people will mobilize. So, therefore, essentially people's mobilization depends upon their understanding of the risk, their understanding of the negative consequences of different kind of capitalist endeavors, may it be nuclear plants, may it be deforestation, may it be ecological degradation. So, common people may find it difficult to understand the negative consequences, and how do they understand that? Through the help of scientific community. So, therefore, scientific community plays a great role in contemporary environmental movements, and this point somehow does not figure prominently in Ramchandra Guha's framework of Indian environmental movements. Finally, to conclude, let us see that what are the emerging trends, what are the new areas, new paradigms that is emerging in Indian environmental movement. To understand the emerging trends, I may use the framework given by Mario Diani and Paolo Donati. So, Diani and Donati's framework helps us in understanding the emerging trends of Indian environmental movements. So, Diani and Donati provided a kind of framework where it distinguishes social movements, or it analyzes social movements based upon their resource mobilization strategy and forms of action. With regard to resource mobilization strategy, social movements can be professional or participatory. With regard to the form of action, they may use conventional methods, conventional forms of action, or non-conventional or disruptive protest as methods of action. So, combining these two methods of resource mobilization, professional and participatory, and two forms of action, conventional and non-conventional, we may find 4 different categories of mobilization. That is public interest lobbies, which is professional and which uses the conventional methods, the formal methods, the institutionalized methods. Second, the participatory pressure groups, where resource mobilization is participatory, but the forms of action is conventional. Third, professional protest organizations, where the resource mobilization strategy is professional, but the forms of action is protest or direct action. And finally, the participatory protest organizations, where the resource mobilization strategy is participatory and the forms of action is disruption or protest. So, let us see that how Indian environmental movements can be fit into in this framework to understand what are the emerging trends of these movements. Unlike the Western or the American environmental movements, where there is a more and more institutionalization, there is more and more professionalization, in the Indian case, in the contemporary times, we find a broad range of happenings. So, let us discuss the emerging organizational trends, how Indian environmental movements or the contemporary emerging new Indian environmental movements are organizing themselves. We may find 4 aspects of these organizational trends. That is, we may find the presence of public interest lobbies, the presence of participatory groups, the presence of protest organizations, and the presence of participatory protest organizations. With regard to the public interest lobby, we find that this is a kind of organizational structure which is emerging in the Indian environmental movement, where the resource mobilization strategy is professional and their forms of action is more conventional, more institutionalized. Like, for example, we may talk about the emerging judicial activism, where activists, where lawyers, where in fact the judiciary system plays a great role in protecting, preserving the nature. They are more professional in their resource mobilization, and with regard to their form of action, their method of protest, they are more institutionalized, they are more formal, and they are more conventional. The second emerging trend in Indian environmental movement is emergence of participatory pressure groups. these participatory pressure groups, so far as their resource mobilization strategy are concerned, they are more participatory, they depend more on, they rely more on mobilization, but they use conventional methods of protest, institutionalized methods of action. What can be the example for this? We may cite the example of Campaign for Survival and Dignity, the organization which played a crucial role in enacting the Forest Rights Act. So, these participatory pressure groups, they are not professional with regard to the resource mobilization strategy. They are participatory, they rely great on popular mobilization, but with regard to the form of action, they are or they use conventional methods of action. They take resort to law, they use judiciary, they use formal mechanisms, and they try to create certain kind of pressure on government, on state to come out with better policies which can protect the nature. And the example that I gave is the recently enacted the Forest Rights Act. So the organization Campaign for Survival and Dignity used the legal mechanism, the judiciary mechanisms to put pressure on state to come out with these kind of policies. The third organizational trend of emerging Indian environmentalism or environmental movement is that of professional protest organizations. What are these professional protest organizations? These are kind of environmental movement organizations which are professional with regard to the resource mobilization, which are well established organizations, but with regard to their forms of action, they use non-conventional, disruptive or protest based action. For example, the emergence of Greenpeace in India. Greenpeace, the global organization for environmental movement, the global organization for environmental protection, now is slowly making its presence felt in the Indian context, and Greenpeace has taken up several issues like its protest against genetically modified food, protest against deforestation, and through which they try to raise important concerns for nature. They are professional groups, they are well organized professional groups, and perhaps they have their branches in many parts of the world, but with regard to their forms of action, they use mobilization, they use protest, they use non-formal, non-conventional ways of method. And finally, the fourth form of organizational trend in Indian environmental movement is that of participatory protest organizations. Perhaps this is more common to find in India, where the resource mobilization strategy is that of participatory, they rely more on public mobilization, and with regard to the form of action, they use more disruptive forms of action, disruptive forms of protest. They do not use formal methods or institutionalized mechanisms. Perhaps example for this kind of organizational structure of Indian environmental movements are many. There are several grassroots environmental movement organizations which use direct method, direct conflict or direct struggle against the state and the state authorities, and where the mobilization strategy is that of mass participation, popular mobilization. Finally, let us discuss the new forms of activism, the emerging forms of activism in Indian environmental movement. Unlike what Ramchandra Guha and Joan Martinez earlier argues that Indian environmental movements are localized struggles, what I am trying to argue here, what I am trying to emphasize here is that Indian environmental movements what I am trying to argue here is that Indian environmental movements may not necessarily be localized struggles, and now what is important to highlight, what is important to understand in these Indian environmental movements is the networking. They are now functioning, or they are manifesting themselves, Indian environmental movements are manifesting through networks of grassroots organizations. Especially we can take the example of the NAPM, the National Alliance for People's Movement, which is an umbrella term, which is an umbrella organizations of several grassroots participatory protest organizations. There are several other national and local and international organizations like Survival International, Amnesty International, NAPM. Now they form networks of people's organizations, they form networks of people's social movement organizations. And secondly, unlike what Ramchandra Guha argues that Indian environmental movements use more primordial loyalties, use more traditional networks or traditional relationships or issues of ethnicity for their mobilization, Indian environmental movements in the present time successfully use the mass media, they successfully use the social media. So therefore, use of internet, use of social media, use of Facebook, Twitter, they have emerged as new strategies, new forms of activism, new strategies of activism. So, in this case you may not say that the participants are the affected people. The participants are a category of people who have little concern for nature, who have a shared concern for the planet Earth, and therefore they are participating in nature. They may not be classified as affected people, they may not be categorized as local citizens in defense of local livelihood, but they are essentially drawn from a global context. They are not limited to any particular geographical area. So, therefore, they are drawn from different spheres of life, they are drawn from different occupations of life, but what is common among them is their shared concern for nature. So, therefore, you may find that the movement may take place in any locality, but its reflection gets manifested in social media. Again, I will go back to here the movement which I discussed in the previous class, the Save the Niyamgiri movement. The Save the Niyamgiri movement was well articulated in the social media, in the internet, in public media, in popular media, and perhaps it is this manifestation, this wide publicity of the Niyamgiri movement which resulted in success of the movement rather than solely attributing it to the local citizens or the affected people. It is true that affected people participated greatly in the mobilization, but mobilization was not limited only to the local people or affected citizens. Perhaps it is the non-local, the outsiders, the global citizens who participated significantly with the help of social media, with the help of internet, with the help of popular media, and that is something which is emerging in Indian environmental movements, which perhaps Ramchandra Guha's framework failed to recognize and failed to highlight. The third form of activism of contemporary environmental movements is way of framing. Contemporary environmental movements frame themselves in multiple ways and multiple mechanisms. They manifest themselves in multiple frames. Along with environmental destruction, now what is being highlighted is concern for indigeneity, is concern for human right, is concern for cultural and religious freedom. So, therefore, these new issues which are juxtaposed with concern for nature, that make environmental movements in India perhaps unique rather than emphasis on livelihood, locality and issue of defense of local space and local land. Perhaps what is important to understand about Indian environmental movements is the way in which they are framed today. Again, like the example that I discussed in the previous class, in the Save the Niyamgiri movement, in the international media, in social media, the movement was portrayed as a case where there is a degradation of nature, where there is a degradation of humanity, where there is a degradation of, more importantly, the indigenous community. There is a degradation of, there is a violation of the cultural and religious rights of people. And these issues also become prominent along with concern for nature. So, it is framing the movement in a larger way, framing the movement in larger rubric with a master frame that helps in success of Indian environmental movements rather than issues of livelihood, issues of local, issues of affected people and poor citizens or grassroots mobilization. Finally, to conclude, what is perhaps new, what is perhaps emerging to understand about Indian environmental movement is the global local linkages. I beg to differ from Ramchandra Guha that these movements are essentially localized struggles in defense of livelihood. What is important, what is central to understand Indian environmental movements is the networking that is now being established between the local and the global. And with the help of this networking, local no longer remains as local. Local transgress the boundary of locality and it gets connected with that of globality. So, in that sense, perhaps it is difficult to say that whether environmental movements are global or local. What is essential is the nexus. What is essential is the connection. So, therefore, to conclude, we may say that Indian environmental movements have crossed a long way through, and perhaps it will be too limited, too narrow to conceptualize Indian environmental movements as localized struggles in defense of livelihood, in defense of local space and for local control of natural resources. There is a larger picture, larger rubric of Indian environmental movements, and to understand that larger picture, we need to understand the global local linkages. We need to understand the master frame with which the movement is now being portrayed, being framed. We need to understand the kind of issues that there is. We need to understand the new ways of activism, the new ways, new paradigms of organization. So therefore, perhaps many things are changed, many things have changed in Indian environmental movements in contrast to the time when Ramchandra Goa has depicted, has written these documents about Indian environmental movements. Contemporary environmental movements manifest themselves through different ways of organization, they manifest themselves through different ways of protest. So therefore, we may find an organizational paradigm, a new organizational paradigm as well as new activism in Indian environmental movements. To conclude, again I will draw from Manuel Castell's ideas and from that of British sociologist Christopher Root's ideas. Manuel Castell says that contemporary environmental movements are becoming more and more science based movements, where a popular science is questioning the hegemony of the dominant science. So therefore, we may find that science has lost its hegemonic power and a new scientific knowledge, new scientific perspective is emerging, which is now challenging the established scientific knowledge, and that is crucial in explaining people the problems of risk. So therefore, contemporary Indian environmental movements are increasingly becoming science based movements. And again, here we can take the example of the movement against the nuclear protest, the movement against deforestation. So where it is the scientific community, intellectuals who play a great role in explaining people what are the negative consequences of these paradigms of development or these industrialization. Secondly, with regard to activism, Indian environmental movements no longer remain as localized struggles. They have successfully established connections, they have successfully established networks with global level non-local environmental movement organizations. So therefore, as Christopher Root says, environmental movements can be defined as networks between organizations, between environmental movement organizations who shared a similar concern, a shared concern with nature. So essentially, to conclude, we may say that it will be too narrow a perspective to understand, to comprehend Indian environmental movement as localized struggles in defense of land, in defense of locality, and for local control of natural resources. So therefore, there is essentially a connection between global and local in Indian environmental movements. Thank you.